atomic gigantification was a sweeping Japan nation when along came a dude with an ultra attitude, a Kamen Rider who's the greatest kicker of Japan. And of all, man, life's too short now, baby, to not talk big now, baby.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Kaiju Conversation. I'm your host, Elijah, and joining me, as always, my lovely co-host and editor.
Hello, I am Rex.
And we are back at it again for yet another and final episode for multiple things, actually. This is actually kind of poetic. Just how many things we're concluding with this episode. Not
unintentionally so.
Yeah. Not only is it the end of our Daikaiju Month, but it is episode 99. We are concluding our double-digit episodes.
Surely it all goes downhill from here, right? Surely.
Yeah, I'm wondering that. You know, I was looking, and a lot of kaiju podcasts end in their hundreds, maybe 200s, but in their hundreds at least.
I mean, to be fair, it takes a little while to get to the thousands, so shocking, I know, but I think it takes a little while.
It's a little scary, you know, like, I mean, either you end before you hit 10, or in the hundreds is when you conclude. And we are in the hundreds. And we haven't even covered, like, most of the Godzilla movies.
We're not even halfway through.
We're not. We're going to be stuck here forever.
Oh, no. How unfortunate.
It really sounds like you're depressed. I can tell.
Very, very. I'm going to cry a river here.
It does sound like you might.
You better watch out.
You better not shout.
They're just going to start. Shut up.
Oh, boy. Oh, we are recording this way too late in our typical schedule, so we're a little more energetic, you could say, than normal.
Probably more just insane, deranged, or whatever synonyms you want to use.
That sounds about right. But yeah, no, next episode's going to be commemorative. Yeah, actually, before we jump into that, most importantly, Rex, how have you been?
I've been doing pretty good for the most part, minus the fact, I don't know if you can hear in my voice, I'm a little croaky. Been a bit sick throughout this week. It just seems I was sick pretty early in the week, then got better, and now it just seemingly came right back, which is a bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. Hasn't stopped me from trying to live my best life, so hey. How about yourself?
Well, it's funny because I just got back from a convention, which we'll talk about in a bonus episode coming up. But a lot of my friends, and I've seen some posts, like some people like, oh, I tested positive for COVID, like watch out. Some people have been saying they've had con crud. I feel like A-okay. Like, I couldn't feel better. Now, I will say, I have been extremely exhausted. I have found myself, like, just in some context, normally I sleep until like 3 on Friday, and then I get up, and then I do my podcasting prep, and then we record overnight, and then I go to bed the next morning.
Yeah.
But for this episode, I slept, like, last night. I, like, fell asleep on accident, and I slept until 8 a.m. when I was supposed to get up. I was supposed to go get a passport, like, get set up for a passport. I went back to bed, slept until 10, missed my appointment, was livid, was awake for like an hour or two, went back to bed, slept until 2, got up, did some stuff, went back to bed, got up, did stuff, started my podcast prep, went to bed for 30 minutes, woke up for 10, went back to bed for an hour, and then finally got up. So I slept through most of yesterday. I've been taking naps left and right for the last 2 days.
I couldn't sleep most of yesterday, even when I wanted to.
It's really weird. So thankfully, I'm more awake now than I have been. But also, I've been more awake overnight, and I have to go to work in 7 hours.
Oh no!
So I don't know what's gonna happen.
That is a little English. That is a little bit unfortunate.
I'm kind of hoping that after our recording, which when we end, it'll be close to about the point where I can only have 2 hours of sleep, I'll be able to go back and do another nap for a couple hours, get up, do my job, and go back to bed tonight and not, have any problems. But I don't know.
Here's hoping.
But outside of that, I've been pretty all right. So what tokusatsu have you watched, Rex?
Oh, well, the closest thing to tokusatsu I've watched recently is... Actually, no, there's two. Sorry. I did recently finally watch the second Daimajin film, Return of Daimajin. It's pretty good. Don't know if I necessarily think it's better than the first film, but it's not really it's really worse. They're both pretty good. But what's not good is a 2006 J-horror remake I watched recently.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe my thoughts. Pulse.
Oh no. The original's not even good.
I mean, I don't think the original's as good as a lot of people say. I think it's a bit overrated. But I think overall it is a good film, and I don't like it that much. But the remake might be one of the worst things I've sat through. One of the most insufferable pieces of garbage.
There's 2 sequels to that, right?
I'm aware. I don't know how you could make it worse. I'm going to be honest here.
And they were straight to DVD, so they had half the budget of the first one.
Pulse is everything... every criticism you could levy against J-horror remakes of the 2000s, Pulse is every bad J-horror remakes trope. How the Ring has, some people kind of find the blue color grading on the Ring mildly obnoxious.
Yes.
At least in The Ring, it actually looks good. In Pulse, the entire movie is absurdly blue, outside of the red tape. The movie is so blue that it may as well just be set underwater.
That's funny.
I hated it. I could not stand the movie. It was awful. Every scene made me want to jump off a bridge, except for the 10 seconds Brad Dourif showed up.
1 year, eventually, I don't know when it'll be, but 1 year we're going to do a J-horror remake month.
What a horrific month that'll be.
Where we will cover The Ring, The Grudge, Pulse, and One Missed Call.
Oh, no.
And it's going to be the longest, most horrifying month.
I think I'm going to hate my life by that.
We're gonna end our podcasting career there. That'll be a month.
Sometimes I watch a foreign film that is really good, and then I just find out that there's an American remake, and I just it just depresses me. Why is there a remake of Tale of Two Sisters?
There's a remake of Apartment 1303 as well.
Why would you remake one of the best Korean films of all? Why is there an Old Boy remake, actually? Why does that exist?
There almost was a Host remake.
I know.
It's never been formally canceled either.
Isn't that horrifying, though? The fact it could have been a Pulse remake. What? Train to Busan is getting a remake. Also, I meant the Host, not Pulse.
Oh, I was like, wait a minute. Are we now acting like it doesn't exist?
You know what?
Just pretend.
It might be better for my mental health if we pretend it doesn't exist.
God.
There's a Shutter remake as well. The original isn't even that good.
I'm trying to think. I don't know what else. I mean, I'm thankfully a little blissfully ignorant on what remakes exist.
And always remember, almost all of these remakes were brokered by the same guy.
Who also worked on the Godzilla Monsterverse.
Yes.
There's a running theme here.
About that.
Yeah, we had a whole discussion about that. Yeah.
Yeah, because
one guy.
I read it about it in a book I read. I read an Asian horror book once. I read it it was in my uni. I'm like, history on Asian horror movies. I'll read a bit of this, and just it kind of casually mentions how this one guy brokered The Ring, and then I looked at his credits and I'm like, wait a minute, why are you a producer on all of these remakes?
Yeah, because he did all three Ring movies.
He did The Ring, he did The Grudge, he did The Eye, he did...
Did he do One Missed Call?
Don't remember. He did Death Note, Blair Witch, Adam Wingard movies, I should point out. He did Quarantine, which is a remake of Wreck, Dark Water, Shudder.
Well, what was his name? I'm trying to remember.
Roy Lee.
Roy Lee. Yeah, so we have Roy Lee here. I'm looking. Vertigo Entertainment. Oh, he worked on Vertigo.
Oh, he also did Old Boy as well. That's another one he did. Uninvited, which is A Tale of Two Sisters.
He's working on the Minecraft movie and the Salem's Lot remake.
The Minecraft movie. Did you see the leaked photos from that?
I did. He didn't work on One Missed Call, and he didn't work on the Pulse movies. But everything else, really, he's done that.
Terrifying.
He's the source of our problems.
Yeah, literally. But yeah, Pulse was hell, and it might be one of the worst Toku-related movies I've ever watched. So that's what I've watched this week.
Oh, that's nice.
Unfortunately. Have you seen anything?
Honestly, no. I was hoping to, but after this con, I've been working on that, and then I had the podcast. But I guess, this is slightly if you look at it in a certain way, it's connected in a roundabout way to Godzilla. So I watched the pseudo sequel, legacy sequel, remake sequel, Twisters, from the John DeBont Twister movie from 1994, produced by the guys who did Jurassic Park. Spielberg actually produced it. So in a roundabout way, it's connected to Godzilla because of that director and Spielberg and Ready Player One and Godzilla vs. the Griffin. It was pretty mid. It was actually really disappointing. I don't understand why people like
the original or the new movie?
The new one. It was kind of boring. It was trying too hard to be giving you all the nostalgia bites of the original, and then it tried to do original stuff, and by that point I was checked out.
Damn, see, I've never seen the original. I
like it.
Almost saw it yesterday, this new film. Almost. And yeah, I probably would have hated it.
Yeah, I was really disappointed with it.
That's unfortunate.
And that's the only movie I've been able to watch this week.
Damn, what about your Daiei movies? I at least watched a Daimajin. Did you see him?
I didn't watch Daimajin. I didn't watch anything.
Failure.
I know. I know, we say this every week.
What about Gamera? Have you seen that guy
Gamera's
recently?
really neat.
Have you seen him recently?
No, I think last I heard his anime failed and he's not leaving his trailer.
No, that's not what I meant. Yeah, I don't see him. I think they locked him in there for 10 years or so now.
They said, we're done with you. Your contract's terminated.
He only gets to come out for mobile game collabs now.
Yeah, he's really fallen from grace, you know. At one point he was like number 2 in the world of kaiju cinema, and now he's not even a blip on the map.
Remember, kids, drugs are bad.
Gamera is really neat. And Shutsuke Kaneko should be able to do his Reiwa Gamera film, but now that's probably not going to happen.
R.I.P.
Imagine what could have been. But it's kind of nice, honestly. I kind of like the fact that like we're getting a lot of kaiju stuff and we're not getting oversaturated. Having like it, you know, Shochiku and Toei did one. It didn't do too well. Yokai Guardians did not do too well. So now we're just kind of stuck with like what Toho and Legendary are doing and like the indie stuff. So it's not like an oversaturation, which is really nice.
Well, what are we going to watch? Because the only other thing I've seen today is, 1967's Gamera versus Gyaos.
Daikaiju Kuchisen Gamera Tai Gyaos.
Hi, that's the one.
Or Giant Monster Dogfight Gamera versus Gyaos. Which, if you're in the United States, you might know it under the title Return of the Giant Monsters when it was released to television in 1968 by AITV. Actually, now that you bring that up, and now that I think about it, I have seen that movie.
Oh, good. So we're not just sitting around here discussing nothing. Happy to hear it.
I feel like we were discussing something, but now we can have an actual focus for episode 99, Gamera versus Gyaos, 1967. Roll credits.
Kamada.
That's the wrong song. That's not played here.
I know, but I don't remember the other one.
It was kind of lame, not gonna lie. So, yeah, we are covering Gamera. Second Gamera film this month. We did cover Gamera versus Barugan, and then we covered Daimajin. So that's kind of a nice double feature there. Legitimately a double feature.
Yeah.
Now, in the chronological order of the Daiei films, we are skipping over The Return of Daimajin and The Wrath of Daimajin, but eventually we will come back to those.
Cover them someday.
In the far future.
Good question as to when.
We'll see.
Who
But
knows?
Gamera vs. Gyaos came out March 15th, 1967. It's the only Daiei film to come out this month, actually.
Yeah, and it was released in a double bill with Malenki Beglets, a co-production, a Soviet co-production.
And to my understanding, that was the first co-production between the Japanese and Soviet companies. It was a Daiei Gorky Films co-production. It actually wasn't the first time this movie had been released. It's also known as The Little Fugitive. It originally came out December 24th of 1966, but it was like a roadshow showing. It was kind of small. It was a few theaters here and there. So when it got reissued with Gyaos, it got a wide release, but it was the B movie to Gyaos as the A movie. This is the last Gamera film to receive the A movie treatment.
Right.
Also, just throwing it out there, the Little Fugitive was co-directed by Tenosuke Kingugasa, who was the director of Gate of Hell, if you know that movie from 1953, I believe it is.
I have heard of it.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, where do we want to start with this movie?
Where were you looking to start?
Well, I do want to bring up something. So when I learned the release date, March 15th, I was a little confused because as we established in Gamera vs. Barugan, the president of Daiei, Nagata-san, had created something for a promotional campaign called Golden Week.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about that, go listen to the Barugon episode. And I was a little confused because in 1966, he utilized Golden Week to release Gamera vs. Barugon and Daimajin. And I was a little confused why they would not put another Gamera film in Golden Week. Because for this film, it was released during spring break for the Japanese children. Now, when I did some deep diving, it was probably because Golden Week for 1967 was already covered by Toho. Toho had their big 35th anniversary film, Crazy Golden Plan, scheduled for that week. Which, you might know that film under the title Las Vegas Free-for-All. Mm-hmm. It's actually a Crazy Cats comedy film that had Peggy Neal of the X from Outer Space fame and the Peanuts. They were in the film. It was actually the first Japanese film to be shot in America. They actually went to Los Vegas and actually shot on location there, which I thought was really cool. And it's probably a good thing Gyaos didn't come out this week because that film ended up number 3 in the Japanese box office for 1967. So it probably would have been completely demolished at the box office.
Right.
But it's also important to note that just a week after this film came out, it competed against the Toei's Children Festival. It was the first annual version of this. This was actually this and Toei's Manga Festival were what birthed the Toho Champion Festival. I'm pretty sure we covered that in which episode was it? Was that All Monsters Attack that we covered the Toho Champion Festival?
I believe so. Either that or
that sounds right. Now the Toei
Monsters Attack.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. That was the first one of Toho's that actually was a part of that. Now, the Toei's Children Festival was a new marketing stunt by Toei to show full-length anime films and to get children into theaters. It was actually, this is going to be funny to say, this in 1967, it was the 10th anniversary of the founding of Toei Animation.
Damn.
That's kind of funny to think about now in terms of like how giant Toei Animation is. But for that 10th anniversary, they made a film called Jack and the Witch. It was an animated movie. It was a larger budgeted film. It was feature length. It was over 60 minutes, and they put a lot of effort into it. They also had a B movie to that A movie, which was Cyborg 009. Do you know how, is it Cyborg 009 or is it Cyborg?
I just call it Cyborg 009.
Cyborg 009, War of the Monsters, which was the second of the Cyborg 009 films. It had a plesiosaur, giant stingray, and a giant jellyfish. So that's pretty cool. Like, they had an animated kaiju movie out of the following week. They also included a 15-minute short anime film from 1959 called The Raccoon Get Lucky. And they showed Ambassador Magma, episode 20, Deadly Battle, The Two Great Monsters, or as it's known in the West, The Clash or The Monster Clash. So Gyaos had to go up against those. Apparently all of it did very well from what I was able to read. None of the Children's Festival and Gyaos did very well at the box office. But there's a lot more to go into the whole box office thing that I want to touch upon later. But that's just kind of some cool little factoids of around the time of the film coming out. Now, unless you have anything else you want to add, I think we should talk about some pre-production stuff, the development of the story and whatnot.
Okay. Yeah. Good time to get on that.
So do you want to talk about the development of the film itself first, or the events that inspired the story?
Let's just start a little bit about at Daiei. Following Barugon's underperformance, Daiei started to take a look at what Toho had been doing with films such as Frankenstein Conquers the World, and kind of took the idea of, hey, what if Toho's done Frankenstein, turned him into a kaiju? What if we did Dracula?
I thought that was something that was decided by Yuasa, from what I was able to read.
It might, yeah, actually, I think it was Yuasa, sorry. Looking at
because Barugon underperformed because it was aimed towards adults.
Right.
So for the following Gamera film, they wanted to correct that. They were doing some course correction. And Noriaki Yuasa had pitched a more children-oriented film.
Right.
And so this is the first of many Gamera films aimed towards children, with an emphasis on more monster action, children main characters, and a less heavy story for audience members.
Right. Although producer and senior managing director Hidemasa Nagata did want to include certain elements of real life events and actual societal films to make the film more interesting. And yeah, I'll get more into that a bit later.
Okay. Now, like you said, this based off of Toho using King Kong and Frankenstein. King Kong, obviously, from King Kong versus Godzilla, and presumably by this point, King Kong Escapes had been announced. I mean, they had obviously announced a King Kong film, but they had that.
King Kong Escapes would have been in production by this point, would it not have been? If memory serves me correctly,
or it would have been It would have been pre-production, possibly, because King Kong Escapes came out, King Kong Escapes came out July 22nd, so it was probably in production by the time this film came out.
Yeah,
because
that's probably right.
The Japanese film industry kind of had like a 6-month turnaround. Like, that's how long you really made a movie, sometimes less. So they wanted to do something along the lines of utilizing the world's famous monsters. And according to Yuasa, Dracula was the third most popular monster in the world. Which I wanted to bring this up to provide some context for Dracula in the Japanese film industry. There wasn't a lot prior to this. There was the Vampire Moth from 1956 from Toho, which was not a real vampire. It was a cop-out, similar to how classic silent films from America would hint at a monster, but it would actually be a normal human. And then there was The Lady Vampire from 1959, which is the first vampire film in Japan from Shin Toho, both directed by Nobuo Nakagawa of Jigoku fame.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if you want to count this, after this, the following film would be Gokei, Body Snatcher from Hell, from Shochiku in 1968. And then, of course, Ultraman has done a couple vampire-esque kaiju in Return of Ultraman, and I want to say Ultraman Taro, and of course Ultraman Tiga as well. So, I love it. I love seeing the films that kind of pull the universal monsters and do their own versions. In the 70s, you had Wolf Guy and Horrors of the Wolf, which are Wolfman inspired films and whatnot. So I do love seeing
the Toho Dracula trilogy.
Of course, yes, the Bloodthirsty trilogy, and Yakuza Apocalypse from a more modern one. Miike did that. That's vampires, and there's also Escape from Vampire Island and whatnot. So, yeah, I really love, there's a whole genre of Invisible Man films. Daiei kind of kickstarted that one as well. There's just a lot of cool, universal monster influences and, more gothic horror influences, which Noriaki Yuasa would really pull from when in his 1968 film, The Snake Girl and the Silver-Haired Witch, which we have covered that one as well. We covered that a couple Octobers ago. That's another good one.
Yeah. This film was once again written by Nissan Takahashi, who had written the previous film or previous two Gamera films and would release a good chunk of what would come to follow.
And originally, this film was titled Gamera versus Giant Vampire, or Gamera versus Vampire, which had a more
Gamera versus Vampira.
Which was a little bit more of a Dracula-esque monster. They even had a special bullet made out of a moss, probably replacing garlic, to kill the vampire.
That would have made more sense than the actual strategy the military uses against Gyaos.
Well, apparently they were influenced by the Mission Impossible TV series for some of that. I don't really get that. I haven't seen the Mission Impossible series, so
I've seen
I don't really know
one of those movies.
And see, this is the TV series, so this is pre-Tom Cruise too.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really find much more on the development of the film. It seems pretty straightforward. After Barugon, they started with Vampire, and it morphed into Gyaos.
Right. Yeah, there isn't too much else on the specific pre-production or writing of the film. But I do know you have a little bit of you have a fair bit of history on some of the context behind the funding of the film, I'd imagine.
Yes, I do. So, just to throw it out there, the film had a budget of 60 million yen, which, if you convert that to modern day yen and then convert modern day yen to US dollar, that would mean it was $1,583,193.20.
For further context, that's 20 million more yen than the first Gamera, 20 million less than Barugon.
But still a good budget. This was Yuasa's
an A-level production.
Mm-hmm. It would be Gamera's last. Yeah. Now, the film, the reason it had such a high budget was because it received loans from the Japan Film Export Promotion Association, which I'm pretty sure we've brought that up before, because they also helped finance Gappa, the Triphibian monster, and the X from outer space.
We've brought up that Gappa was funded by the government, but I don't think we really went beyond that because we didn't really know much else on it.
Now, for anybody who's wondering, the Japan Film Export Promotion Association was established May of 1966. Now, the reason it was established, and this is interesting, I have a theory, right? And I've talked about this before. I don't know if I've said it on the show or not, but I have a theory that the core of everything in Japanese cinema comes from Eiji Tsuburaya. So this association was founded building off of the success of Ultra Q. Between that, Daimajin and Gamera versus Barugon, that's where this started. So it was the idea behind the association was the concept of Tokusatsu being uniquely Japanese, so they figured it would be beneficial to promote the films, and they also wanted to showcase Japanese culture on a global scale. Now, you might be wondering, who started this?
Well, there's a certain man by the name of Masaichi Nagata,
who, due to his very close ties with the political environment of the time, he approached them about this idea, and he got it started. So not only did this guy establish Golden Week and the 5-company agreement, all of which we've covered in previous Daiei Month episodes, but he established this association to help fund the Japanese film industry. Now, to bring up some stuff, this is a direct quote from a committee meeting from the Diet, the Chamber of Counselors, I believe it is. This is what is said that the association is, quote, "The purpose of this association is to promote the export of excellent Japanese films, thereby ensuring the healthy development of Japan's film industry and to contribute to introducing our country's culture and national characters to the world," end quote. So it was basically a funding for films, right? Now, Toho and Toei had zero interest in utilizing this, which is interesting because they were the two powerhouses of the Japanese film industry. Toho, in 1967, Toho and Toei were the top two spots for total box office revenue, followed by Daiei, followed by Nikkatsu, followed by Shochiku.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this association helped finance quite a few films. I actually got a list of a lot of them here. And going off of what I could find, the first film that I could really locate them helping fund was Daimajin Strikes Back, or the Return of Daimajin. It's the last Daimajin film. Wrath of Daimajin.
Yeah.
So they helped finance that. It ended up losing 20 million yen.
Mm-hmm.
But this funding, because it was established in 1966, remember that, because of it being established then, by the end of 1966, companies could utilize it and make films. That is why in 1967 you saw Nikkatsu and Shochiku jump on the special effects train, because those films were some of the highlights for the association to finance, because of the success of Toho's Godzilla series, their deal with UPA and AIP, and this is what would influence Daiei to continue their Daimajin and Gamera franchises until the end of 1966, into 67, and so on and so forth. So that is why you see in 1967, Shochiku release The X from Outer Space, Nikkatsu do Gappa the Triphibian Monster, and Daiei do Gamera vs. Gyaos. This whole time I've always thought that it was because kaiju films were popular. It was just because they would be financed through the government that they would happen. There was no kaiju boom. The kaiju boom, which I believe some sources cite 1966 as such, was truly in 1966 with Ultra Q, Ultraman, Ibra, Gargantuas, and Gamera vs. Barugon, and the Magic Serpent, and Ambassador Magma, and Akage Ninja, which is Red Shadow. That stuff was the kaiju boom. What you're seeing in 1967 is the beginning of the death of Japanese cinema. So this rush of productions is what led to the oversaturation of the market. So just as an example of some stuff, The X from Outer Space lost 48 million, and then a couple other films, Portrait of Chico had no profit. Black Lizard had no profit. Now, keep in mind, these are all films that were financed through this association, through the government. Taxpayer money is going into movies, which is really weird when you think about it. Their money is going into producing them, and then they have to pay to go see them. So I'm sure it created some turmoil on a political spectrum. The Shochiku film Genocide lost 140 million. And then Shochiku used it to produce 4 of their Tora film franchises, which Gilala actually appeared in one of the later films. But they produced, in the time span of this association being a thing, It's Tough Being a Man, It's Tough Being a Man 2, Tora, The Fugitive, New It's Tough Being a Man. Now, this franchise has spanned 50 movies. I don't remember when it ended, but it's a huge franchise. Now, these films were not deemed marketable on an international spectrum, which was highlighted in the cabinet committee meeting April 14th of 1970. However, these 4 films ended up losing 30 million yen.
Mm-hmm.
More so on the Nekkatsu front, Gappa the Triphibian Monster lost 41 million, and The Profound Desire of the Gods lost 100 million.
Ooh.
So, like, film after film, like, they are literally just utilizing these funds to produce stuff and throw it out there. It doesn't matter if it does well or not.
I mean, from what I read as well, it sounded like a lot of this money was really just being used less to even more so to pay off debts rather than to actually be used to create quality films.
As for Daiei, they utilized it for The Snow Woman, Peony Lantern, The Girl I Abandoned, and One Day at Summer's End. Also, they used this for Gamera versus Viras and Gamera versus Gyaos, I believe. And I think Guiron. I think it ended up being up to that point. Or I actually, now that I think about it, I don't think so. I think Gyaos was the only one because the other 2 were co-financed by AIP. Now, this is a lot of, like, loss. There's not money being made here. They're just turning out movies because they're being given money. Now, this leads to, in the 63rd Diet House of Councilors Committee on Education and Culture that occurred October 23rd of 1970. Keep in mind, 1970. They talked about how by the end of March of 1970, the revenue of the films they had financed was a little over 400 million yen. The financing behind these films was 6.3 billion. That is a huge loss. That is a huge loss. This is not a viable, like, business practice.
Right.
In their meeting, they mentioned that the films being produced were worthless and were losing money. My favorite quote from this meeting, I read through the transcript, was, quote, "If you think of Japan's current culture as being erotic and grotesque or monster movies, I don't know what to say." And I think I think that quote, even nowadays, is very important because, especially in, like, the Godzilla fandom, there is this mentality of, like, monster movies being it, right? You know, you watch monster movies, oh, I know Japanese culture. And it's not that.
I mean, like, a lot of the most famous Japanese films internationally in, like, cult film fan circles, Japan is known for its monster movies, its horror movies, and then its exploitation films.
And I'd throw samurai movies in there as well.
Oh yeah, that too. Even though technically their most popular films at the moment are a lot of, like, dramas and romances.
Which is good, but that's a more recent development, right?
Right. But in a lot of these circles, it's kind of, those don't really get acknowledged.
Right. So the members of the House of Councilors mentioned that the progression of the film industry was stagnant at best. And also, it's important to note, by 1970, there was a huge switch of interest from film to television, something that was also influenced by Ultra Q. And to bring up Ultra Q again, all of this came after Eiji Tsuburaya's death. And one of the sources I read kind of alluded to the idea that the concept of giving more money to the companies to produce tokusatsu style films and whatnot was in a way to compete with Tsuburaya. Because due to the 5-company agreements, you could not get Eiji Tsuburaya, who was signed with Toho, for your films. So Daiei had to create their own special effects department built off of Eiji Tsuburaya. Gappa and X from Outer Space utilized Tsuburaya X Associates to produce those effects. So again, Tsuburaya is intertwined with all of this. Following his death, which was in January of 1970, it was decided that it was no longer necessary to utilize this concept of funding Japanese films. And so it was decided to abolish the Japan Film Export Promotion Association. They suggested a national film studio where they would buy up the film studio lots and then rent them out to the companies, kind of like how they did in Italy. And they talked about how right now the film industry was very much like the Hollywood circuit, how Hollywood worked, and how that was not viable for Japan as their film industry was not established enough. But that never came to be, as far as I'm aware. And at the end, they said that what needs to change is there needs to be a more careful consideration from the Agency of Cultural Affairs for future funding. Now, think about it. 1970, they pull and they abolish this funding for films. What happens in 1971? Daiei goes bankrupt. 1971, as soon as Daiei no longer had funds to finance their films, they no longer could produce. Daiei goes bankrupt. Nikatsu, that same year, if I remember correctly, goes to producing low-budget Roman porno films, no longer producing films. Shochiku goes into theater and starts doing kabuki plays. Toho and Toei, however, who never utilized this funding, continue to move on, a bit with less productions because the film industry is crippled at this point. But that is why they continued on. Mm-hmm. They did not need this financing. So Nagata-san, president of Daiei, who started this, is what led to the inevitable death of the Japanese film industry in 1970. And Gamera vs. Gyaos is one of the earliest examples of that death. And the whole kaiju boom of the 1967 year was the beginning of the death. It was not the height, it was the end. It was the beginning of the end. So how is that for recontextualizing this era of Japanese kaiju movies?
I gotta say, before this month started, I had no idea how important and how
horribly
horrible, how much Masaichi Nagata is a really good example of why dictatorship doesn't work.
I also read apparently that one of the other reasons Tsuburaya left Daiei was because he hated Nagata. He could not stand him.
I think,
and that's
I'm
also
pretty sure
why.
A lot of people hated Nagata from the sounds of it.
Yeah. So Rex, suddenly this year of 1967 doesn't seem as nice as... It's weird, right? Because a lot of people...
It was quite interesting to realize that essentially this kaiju boom, this big year of the kaiju boom was essentially manufactured by this loan scheme, essentially.
Mm-hmm. And what this ended up doing was cheating the government out of $5 billion.
5 billion yen.
Or, yes, 5 billion yen, sorry. Which, I didn't convert that, but I'm sure that's a lot of money now.
Yeah. Oh, if we adjust for inflation, oh god, I don't want to know.
And, it's also now makes sense why you see Toho and Toei kind of continue to produce films. I mean, in the late 70s, Toei produced the most expensive film ever in the Japanese film industry, following the death of it in 1970. That, now understanding that, it makes it... Now, I'm not saying Toei and Toho are not scheming themselves. I think Toei infamously has been into some hot water legally throughout the years, and Toho certainly has had its fair share as well, most recently being, threatened with a monopoly lawsuit.
Oh, yeah, that did happen not too long ago. Forgot about that.
But yeah, this scheme is very much a manufactured illegitimate boom.
Right.
Now just as we're talking about all of this, I do want to bring up what films did come out in 1967 that would warrant this quote kaiju boom. You had, of course, Gamera versus Gyaos, March 15th of 1967. You also had The X from Outer Space, March 25th of 1967. Gappa, the Triphibian Monster, April 22nd, 1967. Along with that, you had King Kong Escapes, July 22nd of 1967, and Son of Godzilla, December 16th of 1967. In terms of television, Ultraman, which had started in 1966, continued its run up until April 9th of 1967, and Ambassador Magma continued its run from 1966 into 1967, ending June 26th of 1967. Ultra 7 would start in, I believe it was October of 1967, and run through 1968. And I believe there was one Ultraman compilation film that was produced in 1967. Ultraman, the Giant Monster Battle, I believe it's titled. And that came out in 1967 through Toho as well. So that is the quote-unquote kaiju boom. But like I said, when you consider that, and then you look at 1966, suddenly that year has way more to offer in terms of kaiju content that was actually profitable and successful than in 1967.
Right. Yeah, doing research on this film has not only this, but yeah, my perspective on this film has been completely changed, I feel.
Yeah, you've brought that up a couple times now, and I'm really curious what you found
in this episode yet.
I don't know, but you've mentioned that to me, and I'm already, like, my opinion has already changed due to just learning the politics behind this film and everything else we've covered, because this is our last film from 1967 that we haven't covered.
I do have a question. I don't know if you'd have much of an answer for it, but I'm curious, like, how far did Masaichi Nagata's, how connected was he with the government?
If I remember correctly from a couple, I don't remember when it was, but like he had actual friends in the Diet. Like he was friends with a lot of people in the Diet at the time. So,
because I will say that also, when I realized that this film, I made a connection today where I'm like, wait a minute, this film is funded by the government. Nagata has government connections.
So you mentioned that it makes sense that he would have friends in the government, considering this film. Yes, he had friends in the government. He worked directly with them. I mean, as another example, I brought this up last episode when we talked about when we talked about Daimajin. I believe in that's where I talked about the founding of Daiei and how Nagata literally went to the government and basically bribed them into allowing a third film company to be established during wartime, and how he was able to get Daiei because how he was able to get Daiei to still exist, unlike Nikatsu.
Mm-hmm.
He very much knew how to work the political system. So how does that make sense in terms of what this film covers? I'm curious what you mean by that.
Well, I don't have evidence for. I had a little conspiracy theory going on in my head, and while it's probably not like as crazy as like the idea I had in my head, I think that that Nagata having government ties makes so much sense when you consider the portrayal of the villagers in this film and how negative of a portrayal it is.
How greedy they are, you mean?
Yes, in comparison to the construction workers. I'd like to get more into the film itself before really diving really into that.
Well, I feel like in that case, I think this is good enough as any to actually transition into the actual film and really exploring this.
Yeah. Alrighty. So Gamera vs. Gyaos begins with eruptions.
And narration and stock footage.
Yeah.
Now, this is
if
all...
that wasn't a sign of what's to come.
Now, this is all footage of, like you said, eruptions, kind of establishing earthquakes and seismic activity, creating eruptions to occur like on Mount Fuji.
Right. Inspired by real concerns over Mount Fuji and surrounding mountains in Japan becoming active and erupting.
Now, as far as I'm aware, this was because Hidemasa Nagata, son of Masaichi Nagata, the president of Daiei, he wanted the film to cover something, to mean something. So the way that Yuasa did it was he established it in the first few minutes. That way, it was out of the way, and they could just sprinkle it out throughout the rest of the film. And
I mean, this isn't the only issue that the film addresses. I mean, there's a bigger issue that I've been alluding to, that the film very much has a subplot revolving around.
Well, we'll get to that when we get to the subplot. But this is the main, like, this was the obvious...
True.
Over, like, the obvious metaphor, the obvious message that this film...
Right, and this is the one that probably has the most, like, direct influence on the actual plot of the film.
Yes.
I would say. Given these eruptions at Mount Fuji, they invite our good friend Gamera to show up.
Which...
get a title card.
Which Yuasa very much wanted this film to be a kid's movie, as we've established.
Yeah.
And the way he wanted to do that was getting the monsters in it more.
Right.
And so within the first 3 minutes of the film, which, remember, I've brought this up before, Martin Scorsese's, who I believe said it, 3-minute rule, if you have 3 minutes in a feature film to capture your audience's attention, at the 2 minutes and 43 seconds mark, Gamera shows up so fast. Like, we don't even get into the film proper and Gamera shows up, which I thought was a very smart tactic by Yuasa to do.
Mm-hmm.
Which Gamera then goes into the volcano, and we see him enjoying a nice breakfast or dinner as he...
I'd look at it as a lava bath for Gamera.
That too, that works. Which quickly transitions into a bunch of people getting on a helicopter.
Yeah, a research party going to investigate the eruption and find out what the hell's going on with Gamera.
Now, all of this is it's over narration. They're just narrating and getting through this opening few minutes, which I think is very interesting. It definitely makes the film move very fast. And that's something I appreciate about the film, I want to say it's 86 minutes long, and it moves very well until about 50 minutes in, when it slows down a little bit.
I'd say the pacing was generally pretty good for this film.
Yeah. I think it's definitely better than Barugon, which for me had me trying really hard to stay.
See, I wouldn't necessarily say it's better paced, but I do think the kaiju stuff is far more engaging than it was in Barugon.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that due to budget cuts, Yuasa was director and director of effects. So that visual
flair.
consistency carries over from the drama scenes to the effect sequences.
Right, but I will say that does lead to the drama scenes being kind of looking like a bit of a downgrade compared to how excellent they looked in Barugon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, it's very obvious that a director who's not as seasoned is directing this one.
Right.
Which is both for better and for worse, because yes, Barugon had a better cinematography for the drama scenes, but the stark contrast between the drama and effect sequences is way worse in that
they
one.
They highlighted the mild direction of the effect scenes. That's probably how I would put it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so we see this helicopter fly off to look at Mount Fuji and see what's going on, which they see the boiling over volcano.
Right.
But we also, I kind of felt like, so we get them flying over, we get this shot of it looking down over Fuji, and then they just kind of linger on this shot, and I felt like it was a little too long. It's a little awkward. You know what I mean?
Not this shot specifically, but I think there were a couple like small moments where that kind of happened in the film, where it would just linger on a shot for like half a second too long or so.
Yeah, this film, I don't want to say it's the editing is a little choppy or a little lacking, but it definitely feels like this film could move a little faster than it actually is.
Right.
But it also moves fast enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It just could be smoothened out, I suppose. Tightened a little.
Now, in a very, I think, daring sequence, all like this helicopter is filled with people. We don't know. I mean, we see a lot of people getting on it. It's clearly a huge helicopter. We see this weird glowing hole in the ground. And out of this glowing hole comes some sort of beam.
Yes, yellow laser.
And it slices this helicopter in half, and we watch people fall out of it. And, like, they just killed a ton of people.
Yeah.
This film does a really good job at establishing why humans are in danger, in contrast to some of the Toho films. When you look at Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, or Invasion of Astro Monster, where the humans that get hurt, or even in Mothra versus Godzilla, it's more of indirect due to humanity's stupidity. Whereas in this film, and I noticed actually in very recent films, starting with like Ibra, Horror of the Deep, where Ebra like actually eats people, or in Son of Godzilla, where Kumanga and Kamakris actually attack. There's a more direct, like, the monsters will go after the people.
Right.
And I think that's a very interesting approach that was very recent. Like, that was a 1966 concept that carried over here, and like, it also showed up in 54, where Godzilla attacked humans using his atomic breath in that one shot with the police car. But outside of that, it very much wasn't something you saw frequently in kaiju films of the time.
Right. I mean, Gyaos gets a bit of a body count in this film.
Yeah, no kidding.
But yes, as the government tries to investigate this, we are introduced to some of our other cast members of the film, our construction workers.
With the foreman, Shiro Tatsumi,
played by Kojiro Hongo, the previous film,
who is described as our lead actor, but not the main character. You also wanted Gamera to be the lead character, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, I mean, Hongo and even the Kenny never really feels like anyone specifically here is meant to be a protagonist. Frankly,
right.
None of them really get all of that much development outside of like a minor arc that one of the villagers that the village elder has.
Right. I think one thing that Nissan Takahashi does a lot of is ensemble casts, because I don't remember. I think
Yeah.
we talk about how in Gamera the Giant Monster there wasn't really a main character per se. And I don't recall there's like obvious like lead, there's an obvious lead in Barugan, but there's also a lot of other side characters as well.
Right. But yeah, and this is where we get introduced to the expressway construction subplot, where the road corporation is trying to build a road in their village, but the villagers aren't having it. They are greedy and are trying to wait as long as they can to sell their land for the best price.
Right, which it's specifically a highway.
Yeah.
It's a highway. They're urbanizing this rural area, which was something that grew. I mean, we talked about it in our All Monsters Attack and our Godzilla versus Hedorah episode, how urbanization was growing.
Right. I mean, the thing with this is that this whole subplot is based on the Sanrizuka struggle, which basically, so in Japan in the 1960s, you had the Haneda Airport. That was the only international airport to Japan.
That
at the time.
Wasn't that brought up in Gappa? Didn't that show up in Gappa?
I don't remember. I think it shows up in Gappa and War of the Gargantulas. I think both.
That sounds right.
I'm
yes.
pretty sure Gyro destroys it midway through. But anyways, point is, that was the only international airport in Japan at the time, and so it was very big, but the government wanted to, they could not expand the Haneda airport because it is in the middle, it is in Tokyo, and where it is situated, it is right next to the sea. It is right next to the sea. So they can't really expand it, so they have to make a new airport, right? This is what led to the creation of the Narita International Airport, which was then at that time being called the New Tokyo International Airport. It is not technically in Narita because the people of the actual city of Narita rejected it. So the government ended up deciding to construct it in Sanrizuka. The problem is, when they announced it in July of 1966, they never told any of the locals. They didn't consult with anyone that lived there, even though it was going to require the government to take their land. So this led, obviously, to protests against the construction of the airport. For a good year and a half or so, these protests were entirely peaceful, but after just being generally ineffective, they would slowly grow to become more and more violent, which would then lead to the riot police members and a bit of police brutality on the locals. The movement would eventually draw the attention of left of the youth of Japan and student leftists who would join the protesters. They would kind of cause some problems for the locals, but generally the locals supported their fight. And this conflict ended up going for years. Like the Narita airport didn't end up opening until May of 1978, basically being under siege for the entirety of its construction. Some of the footage is wild. In the 70s, they were constructing the people were constructing giant forts, and they even made a tower that would block where airplanes were going to lift off. And yeah, the protest didn't actually end up ending until they lost popularity, but technically protests still go on today. The last farmer living in the, like, around the airport was only evicted from his property as recently as last year. And the movement had thousands upon thousands of people arrested, thousands injured, tens of thousands on its most popular day protesting.
So how does that directly relate? I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just curious on the similarities here. How does that relate to what we see in Gyaos?
So in Gyaos, it shows a lot of, like, during this opening, we see a lot of the villagers blocking the construction workers and having real, like, big barricades against the construction workers and threatening them. That is true that the villagers were, like, actually barricading the construction workers from getting into important areas where they're needed. The thing is, for me, I noticed how the film kind of it never portrays the villagers in a positive light, but it never portrays the construction workers or the company, the road corporation, which is meant to represent the airport corporation that the villagers and students were all protesting against of the government. The film portrays it as if the people are just greedy, money-hungry folk, when in real life it was people whose land was just being swindled out of them, and they wanted to just keep and protect the land and that they've lived in for years. As, mind you, at the same time, the government, in their surveying what for the construction, was actively damaging a lot of the crops and the farms of the villagers.
You also brought up how it got violent, right?
Yeah, not at the time of Gyaos, though. At the time of Gyaos, it would not have gotten, like, act too violent at the time.
Because I know in Gyaos, they do showcase the villagers went and ransacked the entire site where they had set up camp.
Yeah, I think there was an incident like that would have either happened a little bit before or a little bit after Gyaos came out, involving the student protesters.
Now, you brought up that it would make sense that they would write the villagers as villains in a way because of Nakata's involvement with the government, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is a government-financed film.
So it's it kind of reminds me of, like, how in Godzilla 2014, the military had final say over what the script said.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Like, there's no evidence to say that the Japanese government actually had involvement in the script. They probably didn't. I don't, as far as I know, at least.
It's funny you say that, because in the meeting that I read, there was a screening process that each script had to go through before they would finance the film. They would have to look at it to basically define, is this a film that you could market to an international company? And so, granted, a lot of the films did not end up working out in that manner, but that's probably because a lot of these companies had people that were in the government that helped them get the financing. Therefore, the script that Nissan Takahashi wrote would absolutely have been given to a representative of the Japan Film Export Promotion Association to view it and decide whether or not it would be worth the financing. So
that's interesting. And also, it is the film, and this is stated to kind of by, I believe, Hidemasa Nagata as the intention, as the film intends on correlating the protests, roadblocks, and all them as being responsible for the awakening of Gyaos. Stating, August Rigone mentions that he's apparently stated, I want to let the children know that there were consequences for doing bad things. So
it's interesting.
Politically, this film is very clearly against this movement.
Right. It's against the idea of urbanizing Japan's agricultural areas.
No. It's against the protests. It's not against the government actually doing this. It is all for that. That's what I noticed, because the construction workers are never portrayed in a negative light. It's only the villagers resisting the protests that are portrayed in a negative light. The kid specifically calls them out for being greedy, and even like his sister is kind of not necessarily supportive for the construction workers, but she's a lot more passive.
Mm-hmm. And she and Eiichi end up working with the foreman, Kojiro Hongo's character, to help solve and find a solution for Gyaos. It's almost as if
and
they come together.
And then the film even has a quote-unquote redemption arc of sorts for the grandfather, the village elder, who ends up working with the construction workers. And yeah, because he then goes and provides solutions that he heard Eiichi recommending, and he ends up helping solve the solution and credits Eiichi for that. So by the end of this film, I kind of realize, and also another thing is like the village, to contrast like the village leader, and the film specifically contrasts Hongo with the village leader, where when Gyaos is really going through, like, is really well known and going on various rampages, the village leader is pressuring his people to stay, whereas Kojiro Hongo is like, to the construction workers, I understand you guys are a bit afraid. You guys can leave if you want. It's honestly up to you.
I noticed that, because he's very much like, oh, go ahead and go. We'll hire you back whenever the time's ready.
So I ended up kind of realizing this kind of just seems like propaganda for the government's removal of people from their homes.
See, it's interesting you bring this all up, because historically, I mean, starting with Godzilla 54, I mean, you can even trace this back to King Kong 33, the genre of kaiju entertainment is anti-government, right?
Right. That was something I was going to bring up, is that a lot of the kaiju films, specifically Godzilla in particular, are very more kind of left-leaning progressive stories.
And
this
remember,
is a more conservative government story.
And remember what company did not take the funding from the government?
Toho.
Toho. That's so interesting. That's really interesting, because in that context, once you look at not just Gyaos and Son of Godzilla or King Kong Escapes, if you look at it from a company-wide, the kaiju genre from each company, the Daiei films, specifically following 1966, I'd be actually really curious to rewatch Wrath of Daimajin and see how they portray the Lord in that one. But Daiei, when you think about it, they either don't talk about politics or it's more positive. When I think about Guiron, that's the one that I can remember the best, because I've seen that one the most. The idea of that film is no pollution, no war, no traffic accidents, and that's it. It's not saying, hey, we need to reduce, we need to do something about it. It's just don't do it.
Oh, and also another thing I would be remiss if I did not mention is the fact that the film kind of, again, it portrays the conflict in a very one-sided way, as it's just the villagers protesting and the construction workers are like, okay, we can't really do much about this. But when in real life, there was riot police arresting people for straight up no reason and beating the hell out of them. I ended up watching this one documentary about it that came out in 1968 called Summer in Sanrizuka, which is the first in an 8-film documentary series by Shinsuke Ogawa about the Sanrizuka struggle. And in that film, there's a scene where the cameraman just straight up gets arrested for no reason. And the film crew has to go to the policeman begging to find out why he got arrested, to which they give no answer. And again, and with the riot police, make no mistake, it wasn't like a small troop. It was in the thousands, and the villagers were unarmed up until I want to say 2 years into the conflict, when they started bearing farming equipment as their weapons, because they'd felt pressured into it because their more peaceful protests were doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. Kind of throwing another interesting comparison here. Looking at Godzilla vs. Hedorah from 1971. In our episode, I dive into the protests of Suruga Bay and whatnot, and how the film is very much pro-protests. It's very anti-pollution, very pro the movement against pollution. That, when you consider that, and then you look at the protests that this film is alluding to, and how it's alluding to it in such a negative light,
right?
They're saying the villagers are greedy, they want money, they're looking for personal gain, and they will give away their land. In stark contrast to the fishermen who are trying to make a living and they're suffering, and how something needs to change, and how Godzilla is that change. He's trying to help kill the pollution, kill Hedorah. Whereas in this film, Gamera enables the highway to be made. Gamera solves the problem. Gamera's the solution to building the highway, because he kills Gyaos, and Gyaos was the only thing leaving the highway from being constructed. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it's learning. I'm learning about the Sanrizuka incident or protests completely changed. I'm glad I looked into it a little before I watched the film for this, because it changed how I looked at the film.
So what I'm hearing is, if we had one sentence to summarize what Gamera versus Gyaos is, it's government propaganda.
Yeah. It is. Wow. That's actually what it is. No one talks about it, but that's what this film is.
I love how you and I both went completely separate ways. I researched the more industrial,
No, I'm glad you did, because I had a suspicion that it was government. I just didn't know if Masaichi Nagata or Hidemasa Nagata had direct involvement with the government outside of
yes,
just a little bit of hey, fund my movie.
From my understanding, he had direct contacts with the Diet, and he had direct contacts with the Yakuza, which the Yakuza also have direct contact with the Diet. So this all comes around in full circle with this film being, and Daiei during the war period was pitched to the government as a pro-government company.
Oh.
Remember, I brought that up. We discussed that in our Daimajin episode, I believe it was, where I brought up the whole reason for how Daiei got established was due to the fact that he promised the company would be a pro-government company. Yeah, as I'm pulling up here on my Daimajin notes, originally the government restricted the film industry to 2 companies, Toho and Shochiku. But Daiei president Masashi Nagata went to the Diet and proposed a, quote, control company, end quote, that would be supporting the government, which is how the third company, Daiei, was established and made it through the war period of Japan, while Nikatsu was forced to shut down.
So yeah, once I realized that it was, once I made like the connection in my head a little bit before we started recording that this was government funded, I was like, oh my god, this movie kind of evil.
I feel bad for my overall opinion now, just as a teaser for how I will look at this film. Huh.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So not only have we recontextualized the year of 1967 kaiju films, but we've also recontextualized the Gamera franchise. So Gamera versus Gyaos in a roundabout way is in the same line as Shin Godzilla. It's in the same lineage.
I mean, hey, it's just a trend for kaiju movies to be government-sponsored, I suppose.
We have spent a very long time establishing the context of this film, but I'm not upset by that. I'm sure your hard drive's upset.
Yeah, it will be. But I think it's really interesting because as far as I know, I haven't dug too deeply into reviews because I don't, but I've only heard like the Sanrizuka struggle be brought up in passing by other people. So, and in my opinion, that is one of the most important one of the most significant aspects of the film to me is that.
Especially when you put into the context the business practices of the film industry of the time with the political turmoil at the time, and you get this film, that's very interesting.
Yes.
And even then, like, that puts into context I kind of want to rewatch Gappa now and The X from Outer Space to see if those films are a little more pro-government than initially what I remember.
Well, they definitely had more traditional values, given like the whole like portrayal of women in those films. Like,
that's true.
So
because isn't it The X from Outer Space
more conservative than you'd see from what Toho was doing with the Godzilla series? So that is actually interesting to bring up. I mean, it was both of them that kind of were a bit weird with their gender politics, but Gappa in particular,
yes,
I remember being
at the end
really bad with it.
That's actually really interesting. These traditional ideologies that at the time,
government-funded films. So,
yeah, that's
not gonna lie.
Interesting.
Having that bit of context does kind of raises a few questions on those films, and how much influence did the government have on their scripts? Is my biggest question.
Huh. Well, we've successfully ruined a whole year of kaiju movies for us.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it necessarily ruins it. I think it's actually really interesting.
It is interesting, actually. I'm really curious now for whenever we cover Gamera versus Viras and Guiron specifically to see how those films are impacted by the international appeal that they go for and the governmental appeal that they probably went for.
Right.
Do we want to now jump back into the film now that we've established that it's government propaganda due to the fact that Nagata wanted money for his films because his company was dying? Also, important to note, this is the same year that Daiei announced that they were in debt due to the death of an actor and
one of the actors in this film.
Yes, it was one of the side characters, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was the bigger comedic relief dude. I don't remember his name. I don't think they say it in the film.
I want to say it's Koichiro Ueda. Yeah, because he ended up committing suicide due to turmoil with his job and with his work. And through police investigations, they found out that Daiei was in fact very much in debt. And so with this, this was the turn of the public image that Daiei had. And considering the fact that Daiei was the middleman in terms of profits, you had Toho, Toei, Daiei, Shochiku Nikatsu. That puts into context, I mean, notice the three companies that took the government funding, Daiei, Shochiku, Nikatsu, were not doing very well.
Right. I mean, Nikatsu, when they did Gappa, like it was stated in an interview that I believe we mentioned in that episode, was in the red. And they were in debt, and they used a lot of Gappa's budget, not on the film, but to repay those debts. Mm-hmm. That's why it was 500 million yen.
Right, and actually bringing that up real quick, I do want to bring up, I went and I found the budgets for all of these films. Gappa was at 500 million. The X from Outer Space was 150 million. Gamera versus Gyaos was 60 million. King Kong Escapes was 170 million. And Son of Godzilla was 260 million. Now, out of these films, Son of Godzilla was the only kaiju film to break into the top 40, according to Kinema Jimpo. So that kind of goes
in highest attendance, or just like box office rentals, or
that is in attendance.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes, in attendance, it was the only one to break into the top 40. Though
which is interesting because some sources claim that both Gyaos and X from Outer Space outperformed it.
Even though, and as I mentioned already...
Actually, could it be because Son of Godzilla released at the end of the year?
Maybe. That's right, because Son of Godzilla was...
a lot of Godzilla films came out in December, thus their earnings were generally more considered as a part of the next year.
Perhaps. That would make sense. But see, X from Outer Space, there's no way that was successful because in the Diet's transcripts, they said it lost 48 million yen. Whereas Gappa lost 41 million. Out of that, based off of that and their budgets, Gappa would be the most successful out of them. We know Gyaos made 97 million. So if Gappa only lost 41 million, that means that had a box office of 459 million yen, which is way bigger than Gyaos. So based off of what the Diet said, Gappa probably would be the most successful in terms of box office, but it looks like based off of attendance, Son of Godzilla was the most successful. Japanese box office is really hard to track, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, especially for these older films.
Yeah, that's just based off of what we know about Son of Godzilla, based off of Kinema Jimpo, and what we know of based on the statements provided by the Diet. Now, the budget for Gappa may not have been 500 million yen.
But alas.
Yeah, we still haven't got back to the movie. So where were we?
Protesters kicking the construction workers off the land. We're introduced to the sister, and on top of that, the sleazy reporter guy enters the the mountain ranges.
Right. This is where, during all of this is where we're introduced into the greedy side of our villagers, right?
Yep.
And then we have Tetsuo, we have Okabe, the reporter who goes through the village to look into the mysterious green glow that's been occurring.
As he's taking pictures, he ends up running into the film's Kenny, Eiichi, whom he ends up convincing to lead him into the cave where the green light is coming from.
Which I must say, I love the colors in this film. Much like Gamera versus Barugon, this film carries over the beautiful colors. This is such a colorful film.
There's some nice colors throughout this film. The green in particular really stands out. For
green and red.
Yeah. Green and red.
I love both of those.
I mean, there's kind of that contrast in the green and like the pinkish red, even in Gamera and Gyaos, with Gamera's green blood and Gyaos's purplish red blood.
Right, and purple is derivative of red, so
right, exactly.
Yeah, it's a very nice contrast, and that's something that these early Gamera films, following the giant monster, of course, do a good job, which is creating a very colorful environment. I think these are some of the best examples of the use of color in the kaiju ega boom of the 1960s.
Right.
And that's something I do love about it, because we see a lot of that as Eiichi and the reporter go into this cave with the green glow, which we get a nod to Dracula with some bats flying around, which I think is really neat. Yeah.
But as an earthquake occurs, the sleazy reporter ends up leaving Eiichi to die. But he doesn't die.
He doesn't die, which he gets, karma comes back, he ends up running out, and Gyaos pops out and grabs him and eats him, showcasing that monster to human dilemma that the Gamera franchise really highlights and really showcases, and the kaiju genre started to kind of go towards, honestly, following Tsuburaya's departure from the franchise as the main effects director. That was something that Tsuburaya didn't like, was the idea of violence in these films. He wanted them to be geared towards children.
Right. But as you mentioned earlier, before even the 20-minute mark, we're introduced to Gyaos, compared to Barugon's, I want to say it was 40 minutes for that film's titular monster to make its first proper appearance.
Yeah, they do a very good job at introducing us to the monsters and to getting them involved with the plot very quickly. Now, something that I'll bring up now, Gamera only shows up a total of 4 times in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very interesting. He shows up at the beginning, then he shows up during this scene, then he disappears, and actually it's 3 it's 4. He
shows up for the 2 following battles with Gyaos.
And that's it. He is not essential. This is a Gyaos film through and through, and I think that's very interesting.
Right. But I mean, it works since Gamera was already an established character with the 2 previous films.
Absolutely. I don't think this film suffers at all from that. It's not like Godzilla 2014 or something where it's you're introducing Godzilla and your villain kaiju. You're just introducing your villain kaiju. It works out perfectly here.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of which, as Gyaos goes to take the kid for a little chomp, Gamera shows up to protect him.
And then we get the first little fight between the two, this is a moment where we get a beautiful look at this mountain, countryside set, which is just beautiful.
Oh yeah, the sets in this tend to look quite nice. The Nagoya set that shows up later in the film in particular, I thought was a real standout. It's a really nice looking city and how it's portrayed in this film.
I would go as far as to say this is the best example of miniature work in the Gamera franchise from the Showa era.
Probably. You are probably right.
And
I don't know if there's a high bar in any of the following films.
No, I was like, after this, they don't really do a lot with miniatures, and the only film it really has to compete with is The Giant Monster and Barugon. And I think in The Giant Monster, the cinematography is lacking enough that it doesn't really work out in its favor.
Granted, I will say I don't think this film, effects-wise, has a lot of the highlights of Barugon. I think the compositing is generally okay, but it's not as seamless generally. Although there are a couple of really good-looking shots, mind you.
And I believe this is the first Gamera film to utilize the projection method, where they projected the image on the wall.
Red screen projection?
Yes.
Yeah, I definitely noticed its implementation here.
Specifically, once Gamera saves the boy, and we'll jump ahead and then we'll go back. Gamera saves the boy and flies him down to the highway construction site, which is interesting. Yeah. And they use the construction site's tools.
Now you're seeing it too.
To save Eiichi, and Gamera helps him, he knows to go there, which is very interesting.
And again, he's saved by a construction worker.
Mm-hmm. Now, when he gets taken off of Gamera's back, we do see a rear projection of Gamera as Eiichi and Kojiro Hongo's character are looking at him coming back down. But going back to the fight sequence, we get a really gnarly scene where Gamera...
compared to the fight in Barugon, while I don't think the choreography in this film is particularly much better, the fight itself is... all the fights, I would say, are more... They're faster paced and more engaging.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, just more fun than Barugon's. Where Barugon's fights felt really slow, it feels like they're at least trying to do more with the choreography and add more movement in this film.
Mm-hmm. And they do a great... I think in Barugon, they didn't do a good job at showing how Barugon is a threat to Gamera per se, outside of freezing Gamera for most of the film. Here we see Gyaos literally almost chop Gamera's arm off.
Right, and that's the first part of it, and that's the very first thing that happens in this fight is Gyaos just using his sonic beam on Gamera's arm.
Which this is the beginning of a very long tradition of Gamera's villains just destroying Gamera.
Bro, Gamera gets brutalized in this series.
It's a very interesting contrast to the unstoppable might of Godzilla,
I mean, Gamera's got that unstoppable determination.
Right, and that's the trade-off. You get this character that, Noriaki Yuasa said this, and we talked about it in the Giant Monster episode, where Yuasa wanted Gamera to be there for children. What is the biggest thing a child can learn? Determination, persevering through all their hardships, persevering through bullying, through school, through having to deal with adults. It falls in line with what Gamera as a core character is, and that's one thing that the character has never lost, whether it be Yuasa's iteration or Kaneko's, if you ask Yuasa, bastardization of the character, or even in Gamera the Brave, which I think is a beautiful blend between the two, and even in Gamera Rebirth. Gamera at least is a determined turtle, even though I think in that series he's the least like Gamera. He's more like Gamera Deus Ex Machina, but we're not here to complain about Gamera Rebirth.
That comes another day.
Very, very much down the road.
I mean, speaking of Guardian of the Universe, I mean, obviously that film would be taking influence from Gamera vs. Gyaos, given the titular villain is in Guardian of the Universe, and the Japanese title is borderline the same as like the giant monster dogfight.
Right, isn't it?
Of this film, it's a one kanji. There's one kanji added.
Isn't it like giant monster aerial dogfight, Gamera versus Gyaos?
It's like they added one kanji at the end for the battle, for the word battle, and that's it. It's decisive battle compared to just like regular battle.
Gotcha.
But yeah, because I definitely noticed like there's a lot of like little moments that I feel like, wow, Guardian of the Universe just stripped these, plot them straight in that film, and then maybe reworked a couple of things, or took like a couple like locations and use like put them in, developed entire scenes around them. You know,
I noticed that too. I was kind of surprised. I had never noticed before just how much Guardian of the Universe kind of borrows from this film.
Right. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah,
because it is kind of. I just didn't realize how much of a remake it actually was until this rewatch. Likewise,
it was kind of refreshing to see.
Just attacking a train and things like that, which I completely forgot about.
Yeah, it was kind of refreshing, you know, because we never even talked about our history with this film, but this is like the 5th time I've watched this movie, and this
is about
entirety.
My 4th.
Yeah, so for me, it's like these Gamera Showa films outside of Guiron just kind of blend together. I mean,
this one was my first one, so I remember it a little more than the rest.
So this is like your Guiron for me. Guiron was my first.
I guess, yes.
Yeah, so for me, it's like, okay, so far, it's kind of hard. I mean, I know each film. I know what monster appears and whatnot. But it's like, I know Giant Monster's the black and white one. Barugon's the boring one. Now I know Gyaos. Viras is like, I don't remember like
Viras
the defining.
Is a real boring one until Zegra.
And then Guiron is the one in space, which I remember the most.
Also boring.
Zegra's the boring one in SeaWorld, and then I don't remember a thing about Jiger.
I wish I could forget Super Monster.
And I hate Super Monster with a passion, so it's like I can't forget that one.
I wish I could.
Yeah, me too. When we get to that one, that's going to be a struggle.
That's going to be an episode.
That'll be like the quickest episode because it's just like this movie's garbage.
That's so true. What we should do is we should take clips from previous recordings of talking about the fights and just put them in.
And then when there's new stuff, that's when we have new recorded stuff. Yes, yeah. I like that idea.
But yeah, Gamera fends off the Gyaos and takes the boy once it's knocked out of its hand and returns the boy to the villages, where he is rescued by a construction worker, as we mentioned before. I love propaganda, so do you.
Yeah, so following this, we go and we see the Japan Self-Defense Force as they're discussing how to fight Gyaos, which this is where we get the early examples of Kennyisms, where Eiichi names Gyaos because that's what it sounds like. He talks about how to fight Gyaos a little bit, I think.
He just knows everything about the Gyaos before anyone else does.
He's also just let in there. He's just with them. Granted, here it feels a little natural because they're like asking him about it.
Because he's like a legitimate like key witness.
Right.
So I think it makes sense.
And then another thing I liked was the name of Gyaos isn't 100% like decided upon. Like you literally see one of the Self-Defense Force members like say the word Gyaos, and he's just kind of, he looks back at the kid like, I guess we're calling it that. It's a subtle detail that I noticed that I appreciated, that they're not just like, okay, we'll call it Gyaos. It's more like
it doesn't feel forced.
Yes. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but they basically decide we're going to use fighter jets to attack it.
Yeah, they just talk about what Gyaos is, and then they're just like, okay, attack.
And then after they attack, don't they go back to the same meeting pretty much? And they're like, based off of
that
what
didn't work.
Yeah. And then a scientist shows up and he's like, well, based off of what we're seeing here, this is a supersonic high frequency beam.
Oh no, that was actually before the attack even happened that he was talking about that.
Oh,
he just gives them all this exposition, and he's like, okay, guys, now that you know this, attack him.
right, because they say that they have the same weapon. It's literally just that, but a monster, and like he can't move his neck, even though later on he clearly moves his neck.
Does he, actually?
Yeah, he moves his neck, he moves his head down to like fire at Gamera while he's grabbing him and pulling him down.
Oh, no, the issue is that he can't turn his head.
Oh, he's Michael Keaton's Batman.
Can't. Yeah, because the suit can't. It's literally a Batman issue.
You know, that's very ironic considering what Gyaos is supposed to be.
I know. It is. But it's literally the actual issue that the Batman movies have.
That's funny. So Gyaos easily still defeats all of the fighter jets, and then they call off the attack.
Yeah.
See,
meanwhile, Gamera's healing.
This film suffers from the same issue of Barugan, where they just keep trying different methods to take down the monster, just padding out the runtime until Gamera can quote unquote heal himself.
Right, but in this film, they're stupider.
That's not
Their
a word.
ideas are stupider is a word. Screw
Is
you.
it?
Yes.
I thought the proper word was dumber.
No, stupider is also a word. How have you never heard it? Also, my voice. I can't yell. My voice is going.
Hey, it's about time. I've lost my voice like 3 times on this show.
Yeah, but I'm sick. Screw you.
I was sick too. It's about time that you lose your voice once. So we'll talk about the disastrous attempts of keeping Gyaos down. But after they call off the attack, Gyaos then shows up and eats some cows.
And then the rest just presumably leave as well.
Right. And then this is where we learn...
All the horses we see leave as well.
Yeah. And then this is where we learn from Aichi again, who's like, Gyaos is nocturnal. He only comes out at night. A clear homage to the whole vampire Dracula thing.
Yep.
And so they decide that what they're going to do is keep Gyaos at bay. They're going to use these experimental flares that were supposed to be for guerrilla warfare to keep Gyaos in his little cave. And they put the highway patrolmen, the highway construction men as the people to watch over to make sure Gyaos doesn't come out, which doesn't make any sense. Like, shouldn't that be the government's job?
Yeah, I kind of thought it was a little... I mean, I get it. Like, you'd want more people on this, so if these local guys are here, you may as well have them have the ability to contact you. But it is a bit weird that the government seemingly... if they didn't send a signal, they wouldn't have known Gyaos was awoken.
Despite the fact that they're like, they can literally see Gyaos.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's a little silly, but it's fine.
I do like, because in the film, during these moments, you do get a bit of that horror element to Gyaos, which I do love. I love it when kaiju films integrate those horror bases, the foundations for a horror film. The fact that Gyaos is this looming threat that, like, you get the flashes of light and whatnot, and how Gyaos comes out at night and eats stuff and disappears. I love all of that. I think that's really cool, and Yuasa can do good horror. We've seen that. There's elements of that in The Giant Monster. There's elements here, and then in The Snake Girl and the Silver-Haired Witch that comes out in full force.
Yeah, no, the film really does do a good job at making Gyaos a threat, and I would say unlike Barugon's action scenes where, well, I'd say I would say some of the Barugon action scenes when he's by himself are still enjoyable. There's definitely moments in the kaiju action, even when he's by himself, where Barugon is just, it's uninteresting to watch. Whereas here I feel like the kaiju action is always at least exciting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that is very obvious because following this, we get the Gyaos in Nagoya, which I think is some really, really well done stuff. It's kind of quick, but it works out very well, I think.
Oh, I think it's a fun little city rampage scene.
And, we get the whole sequence of him at the train, stopping the train, eating people. And we get him destroying some buildings. Kind of
splitting
shots.
The car in two.
Yeah, splitting the car in two, which is a very fun little gag. And I like how they stop the car to get the photographer.
I like how all the engine and stuff stays, but only the
body and the seats.
The body of the car.
Yeah.
It's cut in half.
It's a very fun little gag. I very much love that. Like, just the comedic elements of that I think is really fun.
Mm. But yes, in the middle of his rampage, Gamera appears for our second battle.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but don't we have a little aerial dogfight between the two?
Correct. Yes, this is as you said, more air-based than the previous fight or the one that comes at the very end of the film.
Now, if I'm remembering correctly, this is the first aerial fight between two monsters outside of Rodan colliding with Ghidorah in the three-headed monster.
Right. Yeah, I don't recall any other real aerial battles outside of that moment prior to this.
So this is a first for the kaiju genre, and I think it's the fast-paced editing.
What it is, it's actually not too bad. I'd argue it's probably the most fun fight in the film, I think.
I 100% agree with that. I think this is between the camera angles they utilize and the fast-paced editing during this scene, despite the janky effects, which one thing I've kind of realized on our show, we never really condemn the effects per se. I think that's because we both kind of understand the budget.
I feel like in the context of a lot of these films, it's generally fine.
Right.
Like, I get it. I get why it looks that way. And frankly, I don't care. That is, honest to God, the least of the problems I have with most of these films.
I agree, yeah. And because you and I are both fans of this genre, we kind of just accept it.
I'm used to Tokusatsu.
And despite the janky effects with how the suit, these are all puppets, I believe, with some close-ups of suits. But despite that, it looks really good. Like, all things considered, considering this is the beginning
One complaint with this fight is like the kind of weird moment of Gamera's using his like shell to grab onto Gyaos.
Yes.
Which I think is a bit weird.
I agree with that. I think that's a little weird. But
other than that, that's everything else in this fight is pretty good for like the first like proper aerial battle in the genre.
Right. Now,
well, granted, there would have been some in Ultraman actually around this time between Ultraman and various aliens and kaiju.
But that was all beam effects, was it not?
It's been a while since I've watched Ultraman, man.
Likewise, I want to say it's mostly beam effects.
It's been a while. I couldn't tell you.
I'd have to rewatch, but speaking
I'm going to give benefit of the doubt and say maybe it's not that this really isn't technically the first, but
it's the first in the film. Yes. Now, speaking on the problems in this fight, towards the end of this fight, we do get Gyaos using his yellow powder to put out
nipple gas.
The nipple gas to put out Gamera's jets, which causes Gamera to go into the ocean. I don't understand why Gyaos would follow Gamera into the ocean when Gyaos is not a aquatic creature by any means.
I mean, I just took it as him wanting to finish the turtle off.
But how would he do that?
I don't know, shoot him or claw his face or something? I don't know. I don't know what Gyaos' plan is.
I felt like this was kind of a stupid ending to this fight to like give Gamera the leverage. I feel like Gyaos could have easily just let Gamera fall into the ocean and fly off. Especially with how close daytime is. Because during this sequence when he flies down close to the ocean and Gamera bites down on his foot, like the sun starts rising almost immediately. So it's like Gyaos really had no time to like do anything.
I mean, if the fight portrayed it as the sun coming out whilst Gyaos and Gamera were still in mid-air, then him just leaving I think could work. But without that, I feel like I think it makes sense if it's still night for Gyaos to keep attacking.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. I just thought this is probably the weakest part of this fight is this ending.
Oh, I agree. It's a little bit of a weak ending to the fight, but generally I still think it's the most fun fight in the film. But as the sun rises, Gamera's got Gyaos by the foot. In doing so, in response, Gyaos decides to cut his losses and sever it off. After Gamera leaves, the police end up finding it and taking it to the doctor from earlier.
Which it's important to note.
To discover that UV rays are Gyaos' weakness.
Right, because they find it and they go tell the authorities, and when they come back, it shrunk. And then they
experiment with it with UV rays.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the people that discover the foot are construction workers.
Not necessarily for the expressway, but they are just general like civil workers, I'd imagine.
I'm pretty sure they're wearing.
No, because this is like in Nagoya. This is outside of the area of where the construction is occurring.
Right, but my point here is I'm pretty sure this is another example of.
I mean, you could argue it's like another example of like the civil servants being good and all, which I guess, but I feel like that's kind of the weakest, the most mild example in the film.
Oh, we didn't mention the whole sequence where everybody goes into the baseball stadium to hide.
Oh yeah,
that moment specifically is what.
Yeah. That's another thing that reminded me of like, oh, Guardian of the Universe. Took the setting of the baseball stadium and did use that to have a new idea, huh? And then even like the fight ending at the harbor just made me think of like Gamera's emergence from the harbor in that sequence in Guardians of the Universe.
Oh yeah. Also, the people who discover the toe, if you look at that sequence, they're on a construction site. You can see them building stuff in the background.
I mean, it'd probably be more rebuilding the city, if I'm being honest.
Possibly. Or maybe they're building something on the harbor.
But alas, while this experimentation is going on, Gyaos is regenerating his foot. And a really solid-looking effect.
Yeah, I kind of got... It reminded me a bit of Ghidorah regenerating its head in King of the Monsters a little bit.
Oh yeah, I guess.
Which I thought was kind of funny. But during this sequence and whatnot, the kind of intricate between researching Gyaos' weakness and Gyaos regenerating his foot, I remember thinking, oh, Gamera's not in this. Like, this was how long it took me to realize that he's not in this a lot. And I think
I was having the opposite realization where I'm like, oh, wow, this film's really, really giving you a good feel of Gyaos.
It does. It does an amazing job at that, I would say. The fact that they follow Gyaos for the majority of this film, I think is 100% the reason why it's as good as it is. They give Gyaos a reason to be an interesting monster that you want to learn more about and be interested in.
Following this, the scientist ends up discussing with the military how Gyaos is weak to sunlight, but doesn't know quite how they can lure him.
Right, and
then the kid gives them their suggestion to get Gyaos dizzy.
Which is a very stupid idea.
Yeah, for a flying monster. If it was like Barugon or something, like a land kaiju, I'd be like, sure, whatever. Bit silly, but whatever. For a flying monster like Gyaos, who we've seen like zipping around at high speeds, that is the dumbest idea.
See, this kind of reminded me of the whole Z-Plan idea that they had for Gamera, like getting Gamera on a rocket and shooting it off into space. It was kind of like, it definitely feels like this is very much in line with that. Like getting the monster on this one specific thing to do this very specific thing to make it do this.
Right. And the whole plan hinges on a very specific set of circumstances. They use this spinning platform on one of the buildings in the construction site so that they can place like a fountain of artificial blood to lure Gyaos and that it can eat from, and then the platform will turn at a high speed, making Gyaos dizzy. That is assuming Gyaos doesn't just get off it when it goes at high speed. Which conveniently, he decides not to. And somehow it ends up working.
Yeah, it's also the whole human blood thing where they create artificial blood and like, they basically lure him like a shark.
I mean, that's fine. I have no issue with that. I think that makes sense and is actually, like, yeah, it makes sense. Logical idea in the film.
Yeah. It's just, the whole final plan is just...
I will say, them spinning Gyaos just around and around is funny, though.
It is very funny.
As stupid as it is very funny.
And how it, like, actually gets him to get dizzy.
The fact it works, unbelievable. But it is funny.
Now, during the whole and also it's just the fact that a giant monster is being held on a turntable at that current moment. Granted, they do pull the kind of reality check and they have the turntable like blow up.
Right.
But then we get to see how fire, like Gyaos does not like fire, so he puts it out with his nipple gas. Yeah. And then he like destroys another building, which I guess the building was a hotel that was like brand new that Nagata had like gotten funds from the developer to like put towards the film for showcasing it. And he like the developer of that, the owner of the hotel, like called him and was like, "You're mean. Like we just built this and you're destroying it," which is a funny little thing there. But then he like this Gyaos goes back into his cave, and then we get more highway shenanigans. Right.
This is kind of where the redemption arc, the propaganda arc of the Elder comes into play with the villagers who had previously been offering Kujiro Hongo to finally sell their land during the construction, but had held off due to the Elder's insistence, hearing rumors that, their land's is now worthless.
Now, it's important to note that...
And the kid calls them out for all being greedy.
Right, he ends up throwing his toys at the villagers, which I really like the sequence for the fact that Eiichi kind of stands up for his grandfather. I think that's a nice little thing there. Now, it's important to note that this moment in the film happens at the 1 hour and I want to say 10-minute mark. So with this, there is literally about 15 minutes left in this film. And I think this was where I checked the time, and I was genuinely surprised that the film had moved as quick as it had. And then this is where they kind of stop for a bit and slow down.
I mean, honestly, not really. It's like only like a couple minutes till the climax really starts.
Right. But this is like where it does slow down a little bit because they have to set up the final fight.
I would say there's more of a slowdown between the Nagoya attack and constructing the artificial blood turntable plan.
Perhaps. Now, that being said, I'm not saying it as like, oh, this movie is slowing down and it bogs. Like, it never really bogs down. I think this film actually does a great job at never feeling like it's overstaying its welcome.
Anyways, construction workers saved the day with deforestation.
That's right. Oh my God. That's right, because this is where Eiichi and his older sister Sumiko talk about how Gamera
burning the forest to attract both Gamera and Gyaos.
Yeah, because the fire will attract Gamera and it'll draw Gyaos out to put out the fire. And again, Eiichi's the one that determines Gyaos hates fire. And the village elder overhears this, where he then goes to the SDF and talks to Kojiro Hongo's character specifically and is like, you need to burn our forest. Granted, he does say, I don't care about the money here. He does say that in this moment. But yeah, no, they're like, burn the forest down to kill this monster. That's actually, wow, that's true. I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, why would you do that? And then we get, after this, he pitches the whole idea and they go with it. And I
still don't quite understand why they use all the construction equipment to destroy a bunch of the trees specifically.
Right, because he's like, we'll do it our way. And they like we get about 30 seconds of stock footage of taking trees down, cutting them down, which is a little weird. Maybe it's to help build the highway. It's a subtle way to start the development of that highway. That's actually... This film is pro-deforestation. So yeah, following this, they do set fire. They launch a missile from jets that explodes near the cave, and then the sparks from that incite a forest fire that Gyaos comes out and puts out. So in a way, Gyaos is helping?
Yeah.
Also, it's important to note that the village elder tries to say that Gyaos is sent by the gods because of their greediness.
Yeah.
Which ends up not working, because at the end of the movie, they're like, we've reached an agreement and the highway will be built and everybody's happy. So if Gyaos is truly sent from the gods, which obviously not, but if Gyaos is sent by the gods... I mean,
the idea still is that Gyaos is a punishment for the greed. I mean...
Is it?
Hidemasa Nagata even says that.
Oh, because...
Apparently, according to Rigone.
In the film, don't they say that Gyaos is awoken from the volcanic activity?
In the film, yeah, that's the explanation, but it's like a more subtextual cause of Gyaos' emergence is the villagers' protests and their greed.
See, that would work if it was like, oh, the highway is what awoken Gyaos, but it's like, no, some natural events happened and Gyaos is here, which has stunted the development of this highway and the sale of this land.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think the film really needs to go out and say that for that to not be like a subtextual.
If it's subtextual, meaning. It's only there if it's obvious this is how
they do state it in the film as an idea of like.
Do they?
Yeah, you just mentioned with the elder of him.
Oh yes, yeah.
Seeing Gyaos as like divine punishment. So.
But see, that only works if at the end they don't do the whole greed thing and for money and...
Well, the Elder does have his redemption arc, though. This is his redemption arc of sorts. And that redemption is rewarded.
With what he wanted.
Yeah.
I think this film isn't very good.
This film's messaging isn't exactly the greatest to begin with. It's really questionable when you realize what it's actually telling you about.
Yeah, This is not
the whole Sanrizuka situation.
This is not the most
progressive of films.
So tell me more about the forest fires.
Well, they attract the Gyaos and Gamera.
And we go in for a final fight between Gyaos and Gamera. Now, Gamera clearly has learned from his other two encounters with Gyaos because he actually does a really good job at fighting.
Being on the defensive here.
Yeah. Now, there is some aerial battles again, which I love. I love the fact there's a little bit of aerial fight here. But also, there's some, like, Gamera, bites and rips off a portion of Gyaos's wing.
Gyaos's wing? Yeah.
This fight's brutal. There's blood from both sides coming out and going everywhere.
Yeah, and I like the moment where he throws a rock into Gyaos's mouth
to prevent, the beam from happening. And
nice bit of showing Gamera's intelligence there.
Right. And it kind of anthropomorphizes Gamera a little bit, but that was something that was becoming more popular. Gamera's actually the character that I think popularized that more so than Godzilla.
But yes, as Gyaos is starting to die in the sun, Gamera takes his weakened opponent back to Mount Fuji.
Now, during this, he bites Gyaos again by the neck and drags him, right?
Yeah. He drags him into the volcano.
Yeah, I couldn't help but feel like that's, again, very much a Barugon thing, because that's what Gamera does, is drag Barugon into the water.
Oh yeah, I guess it kind of is an inverse of Barugon's death in a sense.
Yeah, it's water and fire, and Gamera dragging each opponent into
into a lake of their weakness.
Yeah. I think that and some of the events prior, it's very obvious Nissan Takahashi is the one writing all of these films, because he reuses a lot of elements, and I'm not going to be surprised if, as we continue on in the Gamera franchise, we see stuff like that appear.
I mean, I think it really works here. I think, the Mount Fuji is obviously something we see at the very beginning of the film, but it's also something that is seen, we always kind of see the mountain every now and again throughout the film. It's a persistent presence in the cinematography that we're reminded of, foreshadowing this ending. And I think it's a very fitting ending to Gyaos and works very well dramatically.
I agree. And I think it's watching Gamera slowly pull Gyaos into the volcano with us hearing one final scream of Gyaos as it's burned to death, I think is a very effective manner.
Its beam fades away.
Yeah. I think it's a very effective manner.
Yeah, it's a very cool ending. Gamera flies away and Kenny waves goodbye.
Arigato Gamera, sayonara, right? That's what he says, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And then we get the first Gamera song, which is not as memorable.
Hey, it gives us a warning of what's to come. Stock footage.
Hey, but I will say, I do appreciate the fact that they held off on utilizing stock footage
till the very end.
Yeah, and it's kind of just like what the credits go over. It's the credits. Because again, we have credits at the end of the film instead at the beginning, which I believe Barugon did as well, if I remember correctly.
I believe it did too.
Because I remember highlighting, hey, the credits are at the end and not at the beginning, as they normally are. And so, yeah, I think that's a very fitting way to end it, with footage from Barugon. And we get our credits with all of our actors, which I think they were played at the beginning as well, if I remember correctly, but they're doing a second round of them.
And that was Gamera versus Gyaos.
Now, because we have a lot of rankings we got to do here. Before we go into our rankings, we do have a couple things left. Do you want to dive into your final thoughts, or would you like me to kind of give mine?
My final thoughts, definitely, if I had not gone into the if I had not looked into the history of the Narita airport prior to watching this film, I feel like I would have a pretty simple, this is a fun kaiju movie. It's, in comparison to Barugon, I feel like it's a more consistent experience in terms of visually and its direction and how engaging it is. But in that, while that does come to the advantage of kaiju scenes, it does lead to the drama sequences being weaker to what came before. But then with the added context of the whole Sanrizuka struggles, I'm like, wow, this movie is kind of evil.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because here's the thing. Before you provided your context, I definitely would say that this film is very much a lot of fun. You know, Gamera vs. Gyaos is the Gamera franchise finding its footing. While
I still like it. It's just I now see a lot of these more, I guess, problematic aspects to the film that I wouldn't have picked up on if not for that research.
Right, yeah, I'm right there with you. You know, while the
compared
film...
to like where like something like Gappa is more obviously problematic in like its portrayal of gender norms.
Right. I will say this film does a better job at making the plot feel more... the plot does a good job at kind of covering up that. But like you said, the
propaganda isn't obvious unless you're like specifically like really, really know about that situation it's inspired by.
Right. And thanks to you and I, now that's been entirely unearthed, and nobody who listens to this will be able to watch it the same again.
I can never see this film the same.
Yeah, I feel like if I ever go back and rewatch this film, it's just not gonna fit right.
I mean, it's still entertaining. Like, I enjoyed watching it, even knowing that, but this film is kind of evil. Like,
kind of.
I don't know if I quite really put properly into words how kind of depressing the actual Sanrizuka situation is. Like, I highly recommend watching the Summer in Sanrizuka documentary and looking into that incident. If you're at all interested, it is, yeah.
I'll have to look into that. But yeah, no, I think while the film does very clearly have a smaller budget than Barugon, and the fact that it is not by as well of a seasoned of a director, I think it takes some of the best aspects of both Gamera the Giant Monster and Gamera vs. Barugon, like the horror elements and the cinematography and the lighting, specifically those three aspects of the prior two films. It creates a very classic film that I think is obvious as to why Gamera vs. Gyaos to many people is like the highlight of the Showa era. And I think that because of those classic aspects, the film just does a way better job at being memorable. And I think it's obvious why Gyaos would be such a iconic villain.
Mm-hmm.
It's also important to note that the film basically created Gamera as we know it for the Showa era. Like, this is what it is, but it's
the formative film for the series.
Yeah. It's very much the opposite of like Gamera the Giant Monster, where you're like, how did this create a franchise? It does such a way better job.
Right.
Now, I do have one more fact if you want to hear it.
Mm.
So apparently, Ishiro Honda sent Nissan Takahashi a New Year's card congratulating him on this film. But,
right. Although some reports say that this possibly was after the first Gamera.
I feel like that would make more sense because I don't know if Honda would like this film, knowing how he kind of viewed things.
Hard to say. I don't know if there's any real conclusive evidence to which film it exactly was. But generally, it does seem to be more associated with this film.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that means we're gonna... Is it time for our rankings?
I believe so. So since it is Daiei Month, I think we should start with our Daiei Month rankings, and then we'll do our Gamera rankings. And then we've been doing a year of 1967 rankings, so we'll conclude with that.
God, this is kind of a hard ranking for me, not gonna lie, because I genuinely think I do genuinely like every film here in this ranking. But at number 4, what do you have?
At my number 4, nothing has changed from last week. I have Gamera versus Barugon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So at number 4, I've got, for me, the Whale God.
See,
But in saying that, I think all of these films are good, enjoyable kaiju fare. It's just the Whale God is I don't know. I think it's a little less engaging, just a little, than these other films.
See, it's funny you say that because for me, Gamera versus Barugon is just a bore fest. Like, that's such a boring film to me. That's
God,
why
I could not agree.
That's why it's
all.
my number 4. But it's funny you have the Whale God as your number 4 because for my number 3, that is what I have as the Whale God because it is a little disengaging. But I appreciate the cinematography and the story elements a lot more than Barugon.
I think the writing in Whale God is generally, it's minus the rape justification.
Yeah.
The writing, other than that, is probably the strongest aspect of the film for me.
What do you have at your number 3?
I've got Gamera vs. Gyaos.
Ooh, okay.
I don't know if I could put it any higher in good faith, especially now in this context.
That's fair. That's fair. See, it's funny. So I'm noticing a trend here because at my number 2, I have Gamera versus Gyaos. I think it's for me, it's more of how fun the movie is in terms of the monster action and whatnot. I think if we were basing these off of what they say, I would put Gyaos probably at the bottom.
Yeah.
I think putting it...
As I said, evil movie.
Yeah, I think putting it into perspective kind of like... It's like people who... How do I say this? Hold on. It's like the messages of Shin Godzilla, you know? The government's not bad if you put the right people in charge.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of similar to that. I think it's in the same vein. And a lot of people have Shin Godzilla very high on their list. So I don't feel too bad, but I definitely have a different opinion of what the film says. If it wasn't for the coloration and this being the foundation of the Gamera franchise, pretty much until Gamera the Brave. Actually, I'd say this is the film that established the Gamera franchise through and through. I think you would be a little farther down, but it's. I feel like this is a more important film than Gamera the Giant Monster, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, for what it's worth, in spite of its politics, Gyaos is still an enjoyable watch.
Mm-hmm.
It just is unfortunate to realize how it is really government propaganda.
Literally.
But what do you have at number 2?
You didn't say your number 2. I said my number 2.
Oh wait, sorry, I'm stupid. My brain go burr.
We went into another government propaganda spiel.
Yeah, the government. Goddamn, man, the government. They just put mind chips in or something. Whatever people say nowadays.
You know, if we were one of those podcasts that like pulled quotes from our episodes and made memes out of them, we would definitely be pulling government propaganda out. And so Gamera vs. Gyaos is the Pulgasari of the Japanese kaiju films.
It is the capitalist answer to Pulgasari's communism.
Literally.
Actually, in the Sunryuzuka, the airport was supposed to open in March of 78, but the reason it got delayed is because 10,000 student protesters, they set a truck on fire and had it burst through the gates of the airport and then stormed the airport and put up a communist flag.
Oh. That sounds like anarchy.
Yeah, the student protesters were a bit more wild than the farmers. Anyways, at number 2, I have Daimajin. It's good, probably the most consistent film on this list, as I think I said last time.
See, at my number 1, I have Daimajin because of how consistent it is. It's funny, your number 1 is my number 4.
I was just pleasantly surprised by how breezy Barugon was.
Oh, I couldn't agree.
Can't
agree.
Like, the more time passes, the more, how do I put this? Thinking back to Barugon, I don't think back to it as highly as how I thought of it during recording the episode.
Because it's hot dog water.
No.
Yeah.
It's good. It's just, I don't know. When I think back to it, it's not quite as good as it was in the episode, as I felt in the episode.
It's hot dog water.
Wrong. You're allowed to be wrong, but you're wrong.
See, number 1 for me, like I said, Daimajin. It's such a good movie. I really appreciate the Daimajin films, despite the fact it's a remake of a Chev film.
A Czech film.
Czech film. It's a remake of a Czech film. I still really enjoy it, and I think
for what it's worth, I think it's better than the film it's based on.
I agree with that, and I think it's better than just any Showa Gamera film made. Daiei Kyoto was cooking way better than Daiei Tokyo, let me tell you. So there's our final Daiei Month rankings.
It's been an interesting month. I feel like I've genuinely learned a lot.
Me too. Like, I feel like this has just been a journey through Daiei.
Bro, it's been a journey through the history of Japanese cinema.
Literally.
Thanks to Daiei.
Daiei literally made everything happen. I mean, it did.
Daiei caused the rise and collapse of Japanese cinema. Congratulations, Masaichi.
But we still have 2 more rankings to go.
Yes.
We got Gamera.
Okay, the Gamera ranking, I'm going to speed run mine because at number 3, I've got the first Gamera, and I already said that. Number 2, Gyaos. Number 1, Barugon for me.
Right. For me, running through it, number 3, Gamera the Giant Monster, legitimately bad film. Gamera versus Barugon at number 2, and Gamera versus Gyaos at number 1. Now,
I'm not as harsh as you, but yeah, first Gamera lame.
Now, this is where I'm interested. Our 1967 rankings. So we've been ranking all of the films from 1967. This is our last film. We are no longer...
It's 5 films, right?
Yes, 5 films.
Okay, great.
So let's start at our number 5, and then we'll make our way up.
I feel like we're both going to agree with X from Outer Space at the bottom.
Oh, that movie's not good. It's barely a movie.
At number 4, I have Gappa.
I have King Kong Escapes.
Okay, fair enough. I've got that at number 3.
And my number 3, I have Gappa, so it works.
Yeah.
Now, this is, I think I know what you're going to put at your number 2 and your number 1. I think we're not going to agree.
Okay. So, are you going to put Son of Godzilla at your number 2?
I am going to put Son of Godzilla at my number 2.
And I'm putting Gyaos at number 2.
I'm not surprised. And then
which obviously is the inverse for our number 1. Yeah. I've got Son of Godzilla. You've got Gyaos.
Now,
which I get. I like both a lot. I just, I enjoy Son of Godzilla more. B, with the added context of Gyaos being evil, Son of Godzilla goes up another point for me.
You're really out to make me the villain here.
Yes. Why not?
Like, what is your end goal here? Elijah is an awful human being.
No, it's just a bonus.
I see how it is. Gamera versus Gyaos is more fun, and I like the colors more. Honestly, that sells it to me. It's just that.
I mean, I think Gyaos is a legitimately, like, pretty solid example of a versus kaiju movie.
I would agree. Now, speaking of that, not to prolong this episode more, but I wanted to discuss a topic because Noriaki Yuasa said something that's still relevant to modern-day giant monster cinema that we have heard from other directors, not meaning to, like, quote him, but they've mentioned something similar. During a discussion about Gyaos, I guess, Noriaki Yuasa said, quote, "If possible, I wanted to make a film in which only monsters appear throughout the film," end quote. Oh, we also have cast and crew still.
Oh boy.
So, do you want to think about that real quick? Because my question to you is, thinking about how it's Noriaki Yuasa who said that, does that make sense why he would suggest such things and then look at today's MonsterVerse? So think about that. We'll have a little discussion about that. I'll go ahead and do our cast and crew, okay?
Yeah.
Starting with our crew, we have Noriaki Yuasa as director and director of special effects. He worked on Gamera the Giant Monster, Gamera vs. Barugon as effects director, Gamera vs. Viras, the Snake Girl and the Silver-Haired Witch, Gamera vs. Giron, Gamera vs. Jiger, Gamera vs. Zegra, Iron King, Gamera Super Monster, Ultraman 80. He was an actor and assistant director on Warning from Space, and he worked on Denjin Zaborger. Nissan Takahashi, a writer, worked on Gamera the Giant Monster, Gamera vs. Barugon, Gamera vs. Viras, Gamera vs. Giron, Gamera vs. Jiger, Gamera vs. Zegra, Gamera Super Monster, Thunder Mask, Denjin Zaborger. Hidemasa Nagata, your producer, worked on The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly, Giant Horde Beast Nezura before that was cancelled, Gamera the Giant Monster, Gamera vs. Viras, Gamera vs. Giron, Gamera vs. Jiger, Gamera vs. Zegra. Tadashi Yamaguchi, your composer, also worked on Gamera the Giant Monster. As for your cast, Kojiro Hongo as Shiro Tsutsumi was in The Whale God, Gamera vs. Barugon, Return of Daimajin, Gamera vs. Viras, Ghost on the Tokaido Highway, Gamera Guardian of the Universe, Yokai Monsters along with Ghost. Reiko Kasahara played Sumiko Kanamura, was in Gamera vs. Giron, Gamera vs. Zegra, Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger, and Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger the movie. Marui Taro played Mato no Kuma, was in The Return of Daimajin. Yoshihiro Kitahara played Dr. Aoki. He was in The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly, Buddha, Gamera the Giant Monster, Gamera vs. Barugon, Gamera vs. Viras, The Snow Woman, The Snake Girl and the Silver-Haired Witch, Japanese Ghost Story Theater, Kamen Rider X, Kamen Rider Amazon, Secret Sentai Go Ranger, and Ultraman 80. Sho Natsuki, your Self-Defense Force General, was in Warning from Space, The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly, Gamera vs. Barugon, Gamera vs. Viras, The Snow Woman, Gamera vs. Giron, Gamera vs. Jiger, and Gamera vs. Zegra. Kichiro Ueda played Tatsumi Kanamura, was in The Invisible Man Appears, Rashomon, Seven Samurai, Throne of Blood, The Hidden Fortress, The Three Treasures, and Kaiju Buska. Yukitaro Hotaru played Hachi. He was also the mentor for Yukijiro Hotaru, who was who was in the Gamera Heisei trilogy. And then finally, Naoki Abe played Aichi. So there's our cast and crew. Now, going back to that question, Rex, what's your thoughts on the fact that Yuasa said something that directors such as Michael Dougherty and Adam Wingard have echoed?
I mean, it makes sense given Yuasa was often, like, going for more child-oriented films, and obviously wanted to highlight more the kaiju aspect. I mean, in this film's case, the characters, outside of the village elder having a little arc, the characters here don't really get much of an arc. So, and especially with the amount of screen time Gyaos gets, it kind of makes sense for Yuasa to have been interested in the idea of really going in more monster-oriented stories.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very interesting that, we never heard anything like this from Jun Fukuda or Yoshimitsu Banno or Shiro Honda, whereas here we have Noriaki Yuasa, like you said, very childlike individual, suggesting an idea that modern Hollywood directors have also suggested. I kind of wonder if that's because directors like Michael Dougherty and Adam Wingard are chasing that inner child. I mean, there's literally a bonus feature on the Godzilla Kong, the New Empire Blu-ray, that says Adam Wingard, 5-year-old, inner 5-year-old or something. Like,
I mean, he directly states that the film, that Godzilla Kong is intended as a kid's movie in like the bonus features and stuff.
So I think it's very interesting that we have people, handling the Godzilla franchise that in a lot of ways kind of are following in the footsteps, not of like Ishiro Honda, but as Noriaki Yuasa. And I think that's something.
I mean, hell, in Wingard's case, he's got the kaiju gore too.
That's actually very true. That's really true. I never thought about that.
So the takeaway here today is Gamera vs. Gyaos is evil propaganda, and Adam Wingard is the modern day American equivalent of Noriaki Yuasa. Gotcha.
That's actually an interesting takeaway. There's been a lot of interesting takeaways in this recording, but the Monsterverse is just modern day Gamera with a big budget.
I mean, yeah, Kaneko agrees.
That's true. Well, I feel like we've done a good job at covering this movie and then some. What a way to close out Daiei Month, the year of 1967, and our last 2-digit episode number.
Oh, man.
This feels more like a celebration and a blowout than anything we could have imagined. This might go down as one of my favorite episodes, to be honest.
Yeah, honestly. I'm genuine. I feel like I've learned a lot today.
I do too. I feel like this was very, very beneficial for both of us, even though we're the ones talking.
It's beneficial for everyone except for the editor, me later, and my hard drive.
It's okay. Your hard drive will be fine.
No, it won't.
But speaking of that, Rex, I believe it is time now to do the most noblest of podcasting traditions one more time before we are no longer in the double digits. I'm going to start us off here by saying, hello, I'm Elijah, and I have a kaiju and tokusatsu problem. Joking aside, I am Elijah Thomas. I am part of the rotating hosts for Monsters with Attitude. You can check us out on YouTube, where we do monthly live streams talking kaiju entertainment. You can also head over to Facebook and join our Facebook group. It's a great place to talk with like-minded people. I'm also a writer. I've written for GodzillaMovies.com and in Kaiju Ramen magazine. Currently, I write for Kaiju United. And my writing has also been featured in the book Giant Bug Cinema, a Monster Kid's Guide from Bear Manor Media, where I wrote about Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. Outside of writing and podcasting, I also served as a consultant on the upcoming Titanic Creations officially licensed Younguri action figure. Go to titanicreations.com/Younguri to order yours today. I've also had the privilege to produce bonus features for SRS Cinema. I have worked on Yuzo, the Biggest Battle in Tokyo, Liverleaf, and I'm developing materials for War of the Ninja Monsters, Geron vs. Gora. All of these can be found on Blu-ray on srscinema.com. I'm also a filmmaker and YouTuber. You can check out my stuff on my YouTube channel, ET13 Productions, where you can see some of my short films and old YouTube videos, along with a playlist that features all of my appearances on YouTube. I do plan on getting new videos out soon, so definitely check that out. I also appeared in a kaiju movie, little-known film called Zillafoot from 2021. I made a brief cameo in the film as Skywatcher number 2. It's got a rating of 3.7 out of 10 on IMDb. So if you want to watch more kaiju, you can buy the Blu-ray on srscinema.com or the DVD from any major online retailer, or just watch it for free on Tubi with ads, or buy it on Prime. You can also check out my action figure photography on my Instagram at et13_productions, and my ex, the artist formerly known as Twitter, thanks Danny, at the same handle. How about you, Rex? Where can people find you at?
Well, dear listeners, you can find me on YouTube at Rexino, on Twitter at Rex_Xenomorph, and on Instagram, Rex_Xeno. And if you want to check out some of my writing, go take a look at the Tokusatsu Network.
And as for the podcast, don't forget to rate us on iTunes. That boosts our ratings and helps us get recommended to more people just like you. If you don't have an Apple device, which I don't blame you, I'm lying. This is a MacBook I'm reading this off of. But anyway, you can rate us on Spotify. To stay up to date with all things Kaiju Conversation related, head over to www.kaijuconversation.com to find all of our episodes, social media, news, and updates. Follow us on Twitter at KAIJU_CONVERS. If you don't have Twitter, you can follow us on Instagram or like us on Facebook. If you're like me before podcasting and you don't have any social media, lucky you. You can email us at kaijuconversation@gmail.com, all lowercase, all one word, you know the drill. And as always, we'll read your reviews on air for everyone to hear. We also have a Teespring store. Eventually, we're going to have original artwork on there, but until then, you can sport our awesome logo on a t-shirt or maybe even a coffee mug. If you'd like to chat with us, check out our Discord server full of others that have similar interests to you. Most recently, in our General 1 chat, there was a discussion about Ultraman Geed, or Geed, however you pronounce it. Which way is it, Rex?
Ultraman Geed.
It's a great community full of great people. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you can be notified anytime we upload a video. We sometimes post exclusives to the channel, like bloopers for episodes or minisodes talking about news or other subjects. We also have an interview with MechaGodzilla designer Jared Kuchevsky on the channel, and I'm definitely butchered his name. I'm so sorry. And a huge thanks to Rex for editing all of these episodes and all the other content we upload. His links can be found in the description below. Along with Rex, we'd like to give a huge thanks and shout out to Danny DiManna of the Godzilla Novelization Project for his amazing vocals on our theme song. You can support him by following him on Twitter at Danzilla93_GNP or visit his website, GodzillaNovelizationProject.com. And a huge thanks to Grattan Conwell from the podcast Giant Monster BS for composing the music for our theme song. You can support him by following the podcast on Twitter at Giant Monster BS or on any podcast platform under the name Giant Monster BS. And with that, we're going to wrap things up here one last time in the double digits, one last time for Daiei Kaiju Month, and one last time for 1967 kaiju films. Thank you guys so much for listening, and as always, please remember, life's too short to not talk big. Bye, guys!
Bye.
We are set, we are in debt, there's nothing to sweat. Life's too short now, baby. And not too big now, baby. Conversation. His name's Elijah, baby. And also Rex now, baby. We love those kaiju, baby. And you will too now.